welcome to the program. David Allison joins us today from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. He is the author of The Death of Demographics, Value Graphic Marketing for a Values-Driven World. David is a former marketing professional, and he is a human values expert today, a global researcher, and now a two-time best-selling author. He is the founder of the Value Graphics Project, an organization devoted to one simple goal: influencing outcomes with shared human values. He coined the term value graphics for an entirely new type of predictive insight. Organizations from PayPal to Lululemon to Five Star School Supplies, Google, and even the United Nations Foundation have embraced this new way of thinking about audiences. His work has been written about in Forbes magazine, Harvard Business Review, Business Insider, and Inc. magazine. The World Economic Forum published his findings, and value graphics are now explained in college textbooks used around the world. David speaks internationally and helps brands use value graphic data to engage, motivate, and inspire the people that they want to reach. Inc. magazine named his latest book one of the 10 best leadership books of the year. And Kirkus Reviews calls his new bestseller, The Death of Demographics, convincing, insightful, and revolutionary. David was kind enough to join me on Labor Day 2023, Labor Day in both Canada and the United States, where he was calling in from. Very rare to have the holiday line up on exactly the same day in both countries, but this year it did, and so we both had a little bit of time for a wonderful 1 hour conversation, which we present to you now. And welcome to the program, David Allison. So let's get right into our topics for today, starting with the theme that will come throughout the entire program, the term value graphics, a term I believe you've coined. I would love for you to explain to our listeners what that means, how they should think about it, and then we'll talk about some of the individual aspects of the term.
Cool. So, no matter what you do and what you'd like to be doing next, one of the fundamental foundational things you got to figure out is who are you doing it for? So, who's your audience? And whether you're talking about sales or marketing or human resources or, building an app or starting a new company, whatever, you're going to have to define a group of people and figure out who they are so you know who you're doing stuff for. And we have a couple of traditional tools we use to do that. The first one is demographics. We're all familiar with that. Age, income, gender, marital status, number of kids, all those sorts of things. The second one is psychographics, which is a nice kind of a big bucket term for everything else we know about people other than their demographics. So what's happened so far, their likes, preferences, wants, their emotional responses to things, which brands are their favorite, how many times they bought a thing, all that kind of stuff. And what we've done is add a third leg to the three-legged stool, which is value graphics, which gives you an understanding of what's driving people. And our premise is basically that that's the most important stuff to know, because what we're all trying to do is get some people to do something. So you got to figure out what's going to make them do something. And in order to know that, you need to know their values, because our values are what drives how we decide to do stuff. So demographics, psychographics, and value graphics, they all have a role. But I'm drinking my own Kool-Aid here. Value graphics is the one that's the most useful.
So nobody just wakes up one day and comes up with the term value graphics or dives into this topic. Obviously, you took a journey to get here. I'd love for you to share with our audience what brought you to this interest in this topic and some of your background and experiences.
Yeah, what brought me here is really quite simple. I was in marketing for the longest time and worked for other people for a while. Then I had my own firm, and we had about 30 employees at one point, and we were working on real estate development projects around the world. And the first thing we did, like everybody does with everything, no matter what it is you're doing, is try and figure out who are we trying to sell this building to, or lease these offices or this resort community or whatever it was we were doing. And then you define them using demographics and psychographics, and you end up with a story about, Bob and Sally, the aging baby boomers who are retiring and leaving their single family house in the suburbs and moving to a penthouse tower in the sky so they can have some leftover money and buy a vacation home somewhere south where it's warm in the winter. And so we go and spend $1 million and try and get those people to come buy something. And then the cool thing about that sector of the business world is that it's like a little petri dish, because you get a beginning, a middle, and an end. So we identify the audience, spend the money, and then within 2 or 3 years, usually I'd be standing in a room looking at all these people who bought whatever it is we were selling and going, Great. Thank you for coming. Ribbon cutting. Here, have a glass of Prosecco. We're calling it champagne, but it's really just Prosecco. And have a shrimp on a stick, and let's celebrate your new home, your new resort, your new office, whatever it is. And I kept looking around that room going, who the heck are you people? Because they weren't the people I targeted. We had spent all this time and money chasing a group of people, and then this other group of people showed up. Now, there's a little bit of overlap, like 10 or 15% maybe, but that's about it. And it kept happening over and over and over and over again. I start talking to my friends in other sectors who are the same thing. I have a friend who's a chief designer of a very large, well known global clothing brand. He said, yeah, they have personas that they are supposed to be designing their stores and their clothing for. And then he goes and stands in the stores and goes, who the heck are all you people? This is not, you don't fit the personas. So it seemed to be a plague that we were defining people and spending money to attract them in a way that wasn't efficient. And so I sold my company and said, I'm going to see if I can't sort that out. And that's where the journey began.
So, as we think about demographics and all the things that you already talked about that are not great predictors. Let me ask, as you get into the value graphics journey, did you find that any particular demographics were predictive or valuable at all as you were getting into how to define people more through their values? So, in other words, does age play any role? Does geographic location or marital status, does it play any relevant role, or even as you evolve, as you go from a younger person to an older person, do values change along an age spectrum? I'm curious what you found because you spent so much time as a traditional marketer in the demographic space. Did any of that help form the foundation of value graphics, or is value graphics fundamentally different and therefore we need to almost scrub demographics from our minds?
Okay, you asked about 10 questions there, but I will do my best. I think I kept up. So basically, are demographics still useful at all? Is the question. They're marginally useful, like tiny little bit, like 10% accurate. That's about it. And this is after talking to close to 1 million people around the world and in 152 languages across 180 countries with a degree of statistical accuracy that's more than you need for a PhD from Harvard, and finding out what really makes people tick and how they make their decisions and what their values are, but also their wants, their needs, their expectations. We got this enormous data set of what everybody in the world is actually using, what the tools that are using to make decisions about everything in their life, which is their values. And so to answer one part of your question, any demographic label that you care to place on people, age, gender, income, marital status, all that stuff, the people inside any of those cohorts, those buckets, those groups, they're only 10% similar to each other on average across the board. So there's a 10% similarity that you get if you start using demographics to understand people. So let's say Gen Z, they're 10% similar to each other, and men are 10% similar to each other. And Gen Z men who make $150,000 a year, there's another. So it's three groups of people who are 10% similar to each other stacked on top of each other. And you get a bigger group of people who are 10% similar to each other. And we go spend $1 million and it's 90% ineffective. So, is it still useful? Of course it is. Demographics, my book for dramatic purposes is called The Death of Demographics, but it's the death of using demographics the way we have been using them. Because the fact is, if I'm selling reading glasses, they're not going to sell to 17-year-olds. And if they're reading glasses made out of platinum that cost $2,000, they're not selling to old guys who are poor. So you still need to use some demographics to put a fence around a group of people and say, here's who I want to talk to. But then where we've been going wrong with demographics is saying, okay, now that I understand I'm talking to rich old guys who need reading glasses, they're all the same as each other. Well, they're not. They're all incredibly different. They're only 10% the same as each other. So we need another layer on top of that demographic definition in order to do our jobs, which is to get some people to say yes to whatever it is we want them to say yes to.
Do you have a theory as to why so many of us default to a more demographic view of the world? Because anywhere that we go, this seems to be the label, whether you're talking about politics, whether you're talking about business, whether you're talking about science. It just always seems that every field goes back to this easy to understand, as you said, age, gender, marital status, and so forth. Is this something instinctive in people? Have you found?
It's instinctive and easy. You hit the nail on the head. It's simple. You can look at a group of people and you can see if they're men or women. Most of the time, you can tell. You ask them some questions about, are you rich or poor? Or do you have a BA or an MBA or a high school diploma? And it's easy to track and easy to put people in groups. And we all like easy. And on top of that, it's really the only thing we've had. So it's kind of a default. We can't be, as a company, you can't be all things to all people. So you got to kind of narrow it down somehow. So you start to think about that stuff. And, here's a great example. You say to yourself, well, we're building a new technology, a new kind of app that, it's obviously it's going to be for young people. I was out waiting for my sushi order. I was picking up my sushi last night at the restaurant down the street from where I live in Vancouver, and there was this guy sitting at a table who wasn't picking his up. He was actually sitting there having his sushi, and he had three laptop screens open in front of him. He had one iPad on a vertical and two laptops, and he was working on all three of them while eating his sushi. And he must have been 65 or 70 years old. Here's a guy, like, it's insulting to say he's not going to be interested in a new piece of technology that's coming out. Like, he knows more. Like, I couldn't do that. I couldn't get three of my screens to work in a sushi restaurant in a way that I could work on them all at the same time. I couldn't figure that out. My life depended on it. So I lost my train of thought. Yes, demographics are easy, and that's why we've been using them. But there's also a more, inherent reason. It's a whole field of study it relates to a whole field of study called heuristics. And it's how we've evolved as a species. We've way back when, think, thousands and thousands of years ago, and you're sitting around the campfire eating your brontosaurus burgers, wearing your favorite, Tyrannosaurus Rex outfit that from Skin and One the day before, and then across the hill, here comes some people, and you got to figure out in a snap like that, are these friends or foe? They coming because they're bringing some, is this a potluck? Are they bringing some food? Or are they coming to take our food and steal our weapons and kill us? And so the only way we could figure that out is with snap judgments. We just look at them and go, okay, they're all young guys. They're carrying spears. They look pretty healthy. I'm going to say these are bad guys. Let's get everybody in the cave and roll the big Fred Flintstone boulder in front of the cave and make sure that we're safe. And so that's part of how we've survived as a species. As we look at people, we make snap judgments based on what we can see. And so it's pretty hard to then move into a boardroom and look at a demographic description of a group of people and not continue to use these archaic, outdated ideas that all men are like this and all women are like that and young people are like this and rich people are like that. It just leads to ridiculous, inaccurate stereotypes that are, as we've discussed, only 10% true. If you think about that from a financial perspective, it's fascinating. Trillions and trillions, whatever's bigger than a trillion, like gazillions of dollars are being spent every year, not just by marketing and advertising firms, but product development firms, public relations firms, policy advisory firms, human resource firms, spending all this money, trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars around the world is being spent based on demographics, and they're 90% ineffective. That's 90% of gazillion, trillion, bazillion dollars that we could be using for better things or in a better way. I would rather know with an 80 or 90% level of effectiveness that if I'm going to spend a buck, I know exactly who I'm talking to. I can design a better product for them. I can design a better marketing campaign for them. I can make things that the world really wants and cares about instead of this sort of fire hose approach where we just scatter shit out there and hope that somebody's going to pay attention to it because we hit that 10% sweet spot for our demographic target audience description. So it's wasteful and it's harmful. It's perpetuating stereotypes that just aren't true about demographic groups like old people, like ageism. What do you think ageism is? It's just a stereotype run amok. We're like, oh, we can't hire baby boomers or they don't know how to understand technology. We're a tech firm. We can't get young people in here. They got no experience. Like we just use these outdated, ridiculous ideas and they prop up ageism, sexism, racism, homophobia, all this other stuff. And they're just wrong. They still have a place. We remember our story about platinum reading glasses for rich old guys. still have a place, but we just got to stop. Because, like, cool, we know we're selling to rich old guys. That's all we know. That's all the demographics tell us. They don't tell us anything about what those people care about and how they're going to make a decision and what their values are.
So, value graphics can be a potential solve for much of this. There's several chapters in your book dedicated to the fundamentals of them. The one that I found most fascinating was the 56 values that run your life. Now, we don't have time to go through all 56, but let's talk about the process that you went through to get to this number. And it's a
Cool.
lot. And I encourage folks to spend some time specifically on that chapter, get to know them, because it really does underline the rest of the conversation we're going to have here today, and helping to understand how we apply them. How did you get to 56? Was there some magic number where you stopped at that, or was there a point at which you thought, oh gosh, I wish I can consolidate these further?
So the story that I can tell you to make it, I mean, I can go into this from a really technical logistics and methodological perspective around those million surveys we've done around the world. But the best way to think about it is just like Halloween candy. So back in the day, when I was young anyway, before stranger danger and crazy neighbors, kids would go out for Halloween. They'd come back with a giant pillowcase full of candy. And you dump it out on the dining room table. And you'd look at it and stand back and go, okay, let's sort this into piles. Human brains love doing that. It's a thing we like to do, how we make sense of our world. We put things in piles and categories and cohorts. So we stood back and looked at the responses from a million people around the world who long form answers to all kinds of questions about what drives them and who they are and what they love and who their partners are and what their hobbies and interests are. And we started looking at it all and it's like, there's some patterns here. There's some obvious clumps that we can put this stuff in together. So back to the Halloween candy, there's one pile over there. It's a big chocolate bars. And then there's, remember the little tiny chocolate bars for the people who are too cheap to buy the big chocolate bars? So you have the tiny chocolate bars, the big chocolate bars, the lollipops, the chewing gum. You start sorting it into piles. And when we did that with all this data, there were 56 piles. There's a pile of things that were all about belonging, and a pile of things that were all about family, and a pile of things that were all about ambition, and another one about health and well-being, and another one about personal growth, and so on. And so there's 56 piles. Now, here's the thing that we don't talk about in the book because I figure it's already enough for people to get their head around. But those 56 values, a value like belonging, doesn't mean the same thing to everybody. In fact, there's 912 kinds of belonging in the database. So that pile of chocolate bars, the big chocolate bars from our favorite neighbors at Halloween, every chocolate bar is different, but they're all big chocolate bars. So there's the belonging value. There's 912 kinds of belonging. Those are what we call the definitions or the alignments. So for a particular group of people for whom belonging is important, what does it take for them to feel like they're in alignment with that value? What are the things that have to be in place for that to occur? So there's more than 8,000 of those alignments in the data set for the 56 values. So it gets a little bit more complicated than we're able to talk about in a book. But in the book, there's a great quiz you can use to start helping you understand the values of a group of people. So you send it out through your CRM system, whatever it might be, and it'll point you to one of the 15 biggest clumps of values that we found after all of this survey work around the world. So it's kind of a little I don't know, it's a little crazy because it's a start. It's a great way to get your toes in the water and to just sort of start to see what values are all about. But it's basically, saying that there's only 15 kinds of people. That's nonsense. I mean, there's hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of little segments and groups that we'd find if we did this properly. But with a quick quiz we can put in a book and you can send out using SurveyMonkey, it gets you down to one of 15 giant archetypes. And in the book, there's a chapter about each one of those. And it starts to give you some tools you can use to start targeting that group and talking to them in ways that aren't just about their age and gender and income and all that other nonsense.
So, one of the things I really appreciated about the way you laid out the values too is that so many of the other ways I've seen this ever done, it's an either or. You are, and so I'll use belonging as an example. You've seen surveys out there where you either are somebody who's seeking belonging or somebody who is a introvert and you get
Right.
all of your energy and and everything is an either or and you have to fit into one or the other. And in this case, this was a list of the 56 and you can be a number of these. In fact,
Oh
many
yeah.
people probably hold 20 or 25 or more of these values just as an individual.
Yeah, and
uh,
they can be all different levels of importance to you as well. I mean, you and I
right.
could like hypothetically have exactly the same set of values, but they'll be in a different order, and some will be more important and less important. So we all have our own individual, what I call a value print, like a fingerprint. But the trick is to figure out what are the values that an entire target audience has in common. Where are the linkages? So you can look at that group because remember, values drive everything we do. So if there's a group of people who are going to buy $2,000 platinum reading glasses, something in their values are in common that are all driving them in that direction. And that's what you got to try and figure out.
And I also appreciate that you had a rank for the world as a whole, which was about the biggest, target audience that you can
Yeah.
have is just the globe, all humans everywhere.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating to see that the number one value is family, which in many ways to me is not a surprise, but it is interesting that that is universally shared by almost every group anywhere that you surveyed in the world. Family is a absolute priority, and right below that is relationships, which you could argue is a subset of family because you have family relationships. I'm curious, as you looked at your list of 56 and how that ranked around the world, did anything really stand out to you that was either surprising that you saw that maybe you as a marketer had not thought would be so high, or conversely something that you had always thought was really important and it ended up as number 50 or something on the
Oh
list?
my gosh, I have so many stories I can tell you. First off, I want to just like give you a little nuance around what you just said because while family and belonging are at the top when we're looking at big giant regions of the globe or at the globe itself, we don't always see them at the top when we're looking at smaller groups like I don't know. I'm just going to make something up here. Wall Street hedge fund traders who are primarily focused on institutional markets. When we get into smaller segments of who we're trying to profile for our clients or for my speaking gigs, it's not always true, but yeah, overarchingly, when we look at the entire population of the world, or like everyone in Europe or everyone on the continent of Africa, we see those kinds of values rise to the top. Tons of really exciting things came out of this. First off, the fact that there's only 56 values is pretty darn cool, in this moment in time where there's so much divisiveness in the world and so many people stoking that, and because it serves their purpose, like you are different from those other people. There's only 56 things that make us different from each other. It's not that many. That's for the whole world. There's, to put it into some context, I always talk about there being 88 keys on a piano. It's harder to learn how to play Happy Birthday on the piano than it is to understand the sum total of what drives us all around the world. It's not that many. We're not as different from each other as many people would like us to believe. I'll give you one really cool example of belonging and family. In the United States, let's go deep into US territory here. Belonging is number one, followed by family. Now, I live in Canada, up to the north of the United States, and here we have family as number one, and then belonging. Now, one of the things me and my Canadian friends have been fascinated by over the last few years as we've watched what's going on politically in the United States is how suddenly Uncle Bob and Aunt Sally aren't invited to Thanksgiving dinner this year because they belong to the wrong gang. They chose the red team instead of the blue team, or the blue team instead of the red team. So belongingness in the US is more important than family. And up here in Canada, we watch that and go, wow, I don't care what color Uncle Bob and Aunt Sally are. They could be striped or polka dotted or green for all we care. They're still coming to Thanksgiving because it's family. And so it's a whole different. No, it doesn't hold true, big, broad paintbrush, but it doesn't hold true for everybody. But statistically, that's what we see going on and how it shows up in the data. I'll tell you one other really amazing story. There's so many. In China, the number one value is family, as it is in many parts of the world. But it behaves in China in a way that we only see in China. Everywhere else in the world, people have multiple values that they're working off of at the same time. It can be about family and your ambition and personal growth and some environmentalism or whatever your particular set of values might be. In China, it's family and only family until family is aligned, till you're happy with how things are going with your family. And then you move on to the rest of the values that you might be interested or that are part of your values makeup. And then something great, something terrible happens to your family. Let's say grandpa dies. You zip back up and it's only about family again until you get that all sorted out and you make sure grandma's okay and the kids are happy and everything. And then you go back and you work through the other secondary and tertiary values. It's the only place where it's kind of like this ultra value in China. And it's the only place that happens. So yeah, I could keep going for the rest of the podcast on fun stories, things we've learned, but I'll stop there.
Well, there's two that were lower on the list of 56 that I wanted to spend a moment on because I was interested in where they fell within the rankings. And again, a lot of nuance, as you said. I'm talking about the global view that was laid out in that chapter in the book, but I understand this applies differently when you get to specifics. But two in particular stood out that fell in the 51st and 52nd place, and that was peace and money. And it's fascinating because peace probably means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And the fact that it wouldn't be higher on the list of priorities was a little bit fascinating to me. And then money, my goodness, we're always told everybody's driven by money. Everything everybody does is a monetarily driven choice. And it certainly appears from this research that while a factor, not even in the top 50. So I'd love for you to just take a moment on those two in particular and your observations of how far down that list of 56 those two ended up.
Yeah, you know what's I love it when this happens because what we're seeing here is values at work. Your values are making you look at that list and go, that's kooky because it doesn't align with your values. See what's happening here? So the filter you're using to look at that list is going, that doesn't make any sense at all. So I know for you that if we profiled you as an individual, I think peace and money would be higher up in the top of the list because it's where your brain is saying they should be. So that's kind of an interesting thing right there. And you're right; they both have multiple definitions for different kinds of people in different parts of the world. Peace can be everything from just being tranquil to having a corner in your home where you don't allow any technology. And that's how you need to get alignment around that in your life, to this global idea that we should all stop picking up guns and blowing each other up all the time, and that nothing's worth doing that. And so it's a value that shows up in some parts of the world is more important than others, but globally, yeah, it's a little lower down the list. Now, there's other things that relate to that can help explain it. So, for example, there's a value called security. So, peace may not be all that important to me as long as I'm secure. And if family is important to me, if I got family all figured out and security, so me and my family are we're all good, then the peace thing, not so much of a big deal. Now, money also relates to things like another value called financial security. So again, financial security is very high on the list in most parts of the world. So this is about people wanting, as long as I got enough, I'm all good. And then there's also another value called wealth. So wealth and money are two different things. Wealth is about keeping score. Wealth, people who are driven by wealth, they just want to see that their bank balances are going in the right direction, that they got more than the next guy, that their 401k is doing okay, and whatever other indicators are important in the community that they find themselves part of. It might be, if you think about it in a more agrarian sense, there might be parts of the world where wealth is about how many bales of hay did I put away this year. It can be all kinds of different measures. Money is about money. I just want, it's not about keeping score and it's not about financial security. It's about, I got to be a billionaire. I guess that's more about keeping score, isn't it? Yeah, they all have slightly nuanced differences, but I think what we're seeing when we see something like money fall to the bottom and wealth and financial security are closer up to the top, more people are gravitating to those kinds of ways of expressing who they are in their lives. And so they end up in that pile of candy on the dining room table as opposed to the other pile of candy on the dining room table. I sure hope nobody's tuning in right now because that will make no sense, that analogy, unless they heard what we were talking about earlier.
When we think about how this applies around the world, you've mentioned it a couple times up to this point, and there are several chapters in the book that you dedicate to the values and how they are perceived in different regions of the world. And I note that you, from my perception and my reading, you did stick to region. You tried to avoid individual countries, except large countries like the US and China, where you might be able to apply these to a nation of that size. But you were able to apply them to regions. And I'm curious, that is sort of an overlap with demographic, right? One
Sure.
demographic cut that you can look at the world through is the region that you're from. But I'm curious why you chose the ones that you did. For example, you chose the European Union as a whole as opposed to picking on individual countries within the EU that I'm
Mm.
sure could have their own value graphics. Give me some of the logic behind the regional nature of the approach, and then some anecdotes about what you found really fascinating, region by region. You could pick any ones that you want. There's one or two that I might pick on. But first, let's just start with why the regions and how you decide to lay them out the way you did.
Yeah, well, I mean, you get into the field of stats and research, and there's a variety of different ways you can chop the world up. And we chose to follow a pretty conventional regional approach to chopping the world into chunks. The exceptions for us were pulling out the U.S. and China because they have such outsized influence in their region that the rest of the region wouldn't be well served by leaving them in. And the let's talk about China. If we left China in Asia, then the results that we'd see for Asia in the book would be skewed by the fact that China's got this amazing, and then also the results we'd see for China wouldn't be all that accurate because it didn't get to be standalone and pure. And let's face it, it's a giant economic and powerful force in the world today. And the same thing for the United States. So regional stories. Africa is a pretty fascinating one. The continent of Africa is wide and varied, but there's a one of the things I remember that was really fascinating there is how high up the list the value of community shows up. Now, community is one of what we call the togetherness values. It goes along with belonging, family, friendships, and relationships. Community is not one that generally is up near the top of the list in any other part of the world. It's halfway down, a little bit lower than that. But in Africa, it's way up at the top. It's the most important of the values that are about togetherness, about the togetherness values. So I had to sort that out. I called some friends and got introduced to some people who are ethnographic researchers in Africa and said, "What's this about?" And they went, "Oh, it makes a ton of sense. There's this principle, this philosophy in Africa, and I'm going to butcher the way I pronounce this, but it's Ubuntu is the name of this philosophical approach to the world, and basically translates as I'm here because you're here, and you're here because I'm here. That we're all basic. I mean, North American context on that. We're all in this together, buddy. So let's help each other out, and that this is an underwriting principle in how they're brought up, how they're thought, how they're made to think about the world, all their everything from a very early age. This notion of Ubuntu is dominant in the way that they're socialized and what values they end up keeping. And it makes sense if you go back into thinking about a lot of Africa, where subsistence level existence was the norm for thousands and thousands of years. There would be moments where you needed help and where your neighbor was the only thing that saved you from dying. And then there's moments where your neighbor needs help and you're the only thing that saves your neighbor from dying. And so this reciprocity, this sense of community was essential to survival. Now, it's still there. It's still this underlying notion of how they approach the world. So I think that's quite beautiful. And it explains why things like family and friendship and belonging are lower in Africa, because those are all just subsets of community. Where we look at it in other parts of the world, they're very distinct from each other. There's my family, and then there's the community. I don't see my family as something that's part of the community. It's separate from. It's a unit. It's a thing I belong to, and then I also belong to the community. In Africa, it's as a community, and my friends are in the community, my family's in the community. We're all in this together. Ubuntu. So it's lovely when we can find things like that.
So one of the regions that I looked at where there was a big divergence between what sort of the global response to a value was and what the region was in Central and South America. There were several where there was a big gap, but one that stood out to me was the value of tradition.
Mm.
And I don't think that was confined to Central or South America, but it stood out to me that it was one of those top 10 values in the region. And it was a significantly higher score there than it was in the world as a whole. I'm curious, as you look through the different regions and you saw tradition pop up, it seemed to be at a different level in different parts of the world. What does that mean to you in the way you think about values as they apply to a region? Because I feel like tradition is valued in many cultures in different ways, but in some cases, it really seemed to pop out and stand out on the page that this was a very important
Hmm.
part of this part of the world's view of themselves and the world. And then, how would you, as either a marketer or a business leader, how would you respect and honor that concept of tradition when oftentimes as a marketer we are coming in as the new kid, as the new thing, as somebody that's looking forward and not so much, honoring necessarily all that came before it?
Okay, so let's do this way. First off, a little bit of context around what makes a thing of value, because I think that's important to understand if we're going to dive into this question. So, a value is something that a person or a population of those people uses as a way to see everything that happens in their life. What makes it not a behavior, here's a great example, is environmentalism. So for some people who are very, they have a lot of environmental and sustainable behaviors in their life, but it's not a filter that they're using to make every decision about everything in their life. It's just a behavior. Now they may be behaving in environmental ways because they're thinking about their family. That's the value. Environmentalism is just a behavior. But in the case of tradition, it means that for the population of Central and South America, that it's a dominant value. It's a way that everyone, from a statistical perspective, is making decisions about everything, not just some, cultural traditions. On Sunday we go to church, or there's this festival at this time of year, or the mosque has this thing that happens at this time, or whatever. So, what would it mean as a marketer? Well, let's play a little game. Let's make up something, and you and I will brainstorm a little bit about it. So, let's say we're trying to build, we're going to make a product in Central and South America. And what's a category that you're familiar with? What's a product category where you've worked?
Financial services.
Okay, so we're in financial services, and we're going to launch a new wealth advisory group in Central and South America. And we know that tradition is a way that our target audience is making decisions about everything. So, as a financial services advisor in Central and South America, what would you do to prove, to show, to signal, to demonstrate that you respect traditions in the way that you approach the world too? What do you think you might do?
It's a good question. I haven't thought much about that in that part of the world.
Well, let's say there's a certain, I don't know my Central and South American festivals and traditions all that well, but let's say there's Festival X. We'll just call it Festival X. So as a wealth advisor, you could just shut down and say, okay, we're going to honor that this is a big national holiday, is a big festival. Or you could say, we should actually be part of this somehow. We should be, again, making up stuff. Sorry for anybody listening from Central and South America that I don't know your culture better than I do, but I'd love to hear from you if you want to teach me some things. Let's say there's a parade as part of this particular festival. How can you sponsor the parade? How could you volunteer your time on the parade organizer, the festival organizing committee, and be the wealth advisor for that particular festival for the donations that they get in and for the spending that they have to do to make the festival come together every year? Could you get your clients to agree that a certain, a 1/4% on something comes a kind of investment or something that's going to be a donation to that particular festival's nonprofit budget so that you can have a better festival because you are now in the community and you're respecting and honoring that tradition? Those are not things that a wealth advisor would normally do. But because you know for a fact, with more accuracy than you need for a PhD, the tradition is one of the buttons you can push in that particular environment, you'd end up doing stuff that you otherwise wouldn't do. Because what you would do instead is you'd use demographics. You'd say, okay, I'm in a new market, and my clients, the people I want to attract as clients to my new wealth advisory, are rich people. Well, what are rich people like? Champagne and caviar. They like Rolls Royces and Rolexes. They like, I'm being silly to make a point. You'd go out and do traditional rich people stuff. And you wouldn't probably think about how can you help that local traditional festival that's been going on for 1,000 years. I'm like, that's not really my thing. You see what I'm saying? It takes you down a path towards coming up with strategies, ideas, tactics that are directly aligned with what people are looking for deep inside, instead of this surface level nonsense that we end up doing when we use demographics to try and understand people.
Would you also say that the application of value graphics over and above helping you in targeting is also a good way for you to avoid traps? Because if you know there are key values in a portion of the world or whoever your target audience is, maybe you can or can't authentically market to it, but you can certainly avoid conflicting with
Yeah.
a key value.
Yeah. Okay. So without trying to get myself in trouble with anybody, let's talk about a very high profile thing that's just happened to a certain beer manufacturer in the United States who went out and thought they were doing something good and trying to support an underrepresented, marginalized community within the population. We all know what I'm talking about, I hope. And there was a massive, massive backlash. Share prices fell, market share fell, all kinds of terrible economic repercussions. So here's a company who thought they were doing something good, being a good corporate citizen. Someone in there went, you know what? This is a good idea. We need to support this group of people who are underrepresented. They didn't do it maliciously. They didn't sit back and go, how can we get everybody angry? This is the perfect opportunity. They thought they were doing something good. What's wrong was that they didn't understand the values of their stakeholders. And if they understood those in advance, if they understood the values of not just their customers and prospects, but also their partners and suppliers and their employees and their workforce, and yes, their shareholders, but if they understood everyone's values and then stood back and said, okay, if that's what everyone's focused on, if that's what everybody cares about so much that it drives all the decisions in their life, what can we do to be a good corporate citizen? They probably wouldn't have gone down that road. They would have done something else. They could have supported childhood literacy projects, or they could have supported all kinds of different things. The fact is, not every cause is appropriate to be supported by every organization. Some organizations should support some stuff and others should support other stuff. And how do you decide? Figure out what people give a damn about and then support that stuff. It's pretty straightforward, really.
And I think the best example beyond the one that you gave there may also be a company that knows that something that they're going to do is going to animate a certain part of the population, but it's a part that's not part of their target audience. And in fact, by antagonizing a portion of the audience, it may motivate the folks that they are trying to market to because that is a core value. Again, without giving brand names, we can give an example of a well known athletic apparel company, for example, that here in the U.S. supported some social causes in the recent years, mostly related to race and injustice in policing. And I think they understood who their market was and they were appealing to that. But in some ways, by antagonizing another group that was not in their target audience and getting a reaction from them, if anything, it helped them gain more credibility among those who shared the values that that particular company shared.
Yeah. Now, listen, I'm not advocating for this approach, but everybody likes everyone likes a good fight. So if you can go out there and support a group of people that you know are going to get your enemies all riled up, that's going to be a great way to get some more support from the people who are on your team. Again, without naming names, you can see it happening in the political arena right now. Certain very well known ex politician in the United States. I don't know why we're skipping around everybody's names, but let's just call this one out. It's Donald, as he used to be known before he became what he is now. Uh, uh, One of his best games. I don't know if this is because he's an evil genius or a smartest man on earth or what he is, but he gets his base riled up by going after a common enemy. And so he can get everybody, oh my God, look, he's going after those guys. Yeah, we got to support this guy. He's on our side. It's a, yeah, it's kind of it's an unfortunate aspect of human nature that we want to jump in and we want to pile on. And you know what? I got to say this out loud, particularly in the United States where belonging is so high. I want to feel like I'm part of a team here and the team is going after those guys. So let's jump on and go do that.
When we get into those archetypes that you had mentioned earlier, there are 15 of them. Now, I don't think we're going to have time to go through all 15 today, but first of all, maybe help our audience understand what an archetype is, how the value graphics apply to each. And then perhaps we can take an example of one or two, just so that folks can have a better understanding of how to use this information as they get into your book.
Sure. So an archetype is saying, listen, we got all these million surveys we've done around the world, all this rich contextualized data about all these people, and we put them all in piles on the dining room table again. And because we can't really, in the course of a quiz, help you identify which of the 56 values are applying in the best possible ways. Um, uh, but what we could do is we could rearrange that Halloween candy into 15 piles, and say, you know what, I'm gonna push them all together. All the chocolate bars and all the chocolate candies can be in one giant pile of anything made of chocolate instead of dividing it down any further. So it's not the most accurate thing in the world. It's saying all the kinds of people in the entire planet fit into 15 categories. However, it's still more accurate than using giant categories like all old people or all rich people. It's still far more accurate than that. So the quiz in the book will lead you to understand, for whoever you send that quiz out to, the group of people that you send it to, use Survey Monkey or whatever kind of CRM system you have that will help you, Mailchimp or all these primate based names that we have for sending out surveys. It should be like a quiz orangutan. There's the next one that we can get somebody to make. Send it out. Get as many people as possible to respond. Their responses will tell you which of these 15 archetypes to take a look at. So let's take a look at one that we have called the loyalists. So what do we know about the loyalists? Well, guess what? Loyalty is way up at the top of the list here. It's even more important in their list of values than things like we've been talking about, like belonging and family. So, loyalty people, one of the things we can tell you about them is loyalty people have routines and rituals and things that they don't like to have disturbed. They're probably that person you know who has a favorite seat and a favorite restaurant and a favorite menu item. They probably have been with the same person for a very, very long time. They probably have a small group of friends who they're very, very loyal to, and they're not so interested in that changing. They don't want those people to go away, and it's really hard to become one of that small group of folks. They might even collect things. Loyalists tend to be people who are loyal to a particular product or a type of thing. So there'll be art collectors, stamp collectors, could even be experience collectors, people who are very big on staying in some kind of particular hotel, and every time they go to a new city they want to stay in a hotel like that, and that's where they're collecting experiences. So if you start to see these kinds of patterns in one of these archetypes, and let's say the loyalists is the archetype that shows up after you've done the quiz with your target audience, well, you go back to the little exercise we were doing around your fictitious financial advisory group that's opening up in Central and South America and say, okay, we got a whole bunch of really, really loyal people. We know these are the kinds of things that get them cranked up. So now let's pretend we're opening a financial wealth advisory firm and we're targeting loyalists. Well, what would you do with that one? What you'd want to do with that one is say, uh, on your website, you'd have some kind of a timeline that shows the length of time that your clients have been with you, and maybe even highlight certain long-standing examples of loyalty between you and a client where they've been with you for 2 generations now. Your dad started the firm, now you're running the firm. Their kids, their dad was, and now they're the kids, and they're still with you. And that could be a great little blog post or a story that you share on your website to just show this reciprocal loyalty. You wouldn't want to change anything on these folks ever too often. So new processes, new systems for whatever you do, don't make them learn a new app or figure out some new way of interfacing with the information that they're looking for. That's not the way it's always been done. They're not going to be all that excited about it being something brand new and different. Uh, there should be some overlap here, some traditions in the way you approach client service here. Maybe there's a quarterly meeting where you bring everybody together and there's a guest speaker, like, I don't know, some guy named David who wrote about values. And you pay David a whole lot of money and he comes in once a quarter, you get a speaker like that. And everybody knows it's time for our quarterly meeting with our friend Brian, the wealth advisor, who's been looking after my family for 2 generations. And I bring the kids because he always has a little setup over in a side room for the kids, and they love coming to it. It's just always the way it goes. So you could start to build a way to interact with your folks, with your people, based on this thing you know about them. And this is a really great moment to maybe bring this thought up. When you're away, it usually happens when you're away on a conference or a vacation or something like that. And you meet someone sometimes and you just click. We've all had it happen. It's a basic experience and part of being human. And within 15 minutes, you're finishing each other's sentences, and it's like you've known each other your whole life. And one of you turns to the other and says that probably like, how is it? Like, I feel like, are you sure we haven't met? It's just a thing that happens. Well, what's going on there is you found someone, you can call them a fast friend. Their values are the same as yours. And because we all filter the world through our values, like something's happening on the other side of the room and you both look at it and you go, and you look at each other, you don't even have to talk because you both know how you're reacting to that thing because you're looking at it with exactly the same values, right? And then let's say the next morning you meet your new friend for breakfast and they're sad because they had an upsetting phone call from home last night. You'd know what you needed to say to make them feel a little bit better because you know what values they're using to process this bad information they had from home last night. So your fast friend, your values symbiotic with. If you know the values of your target audience, it's like you know them like your friends. And now your job every day as a marketer, as a business owner, as a people and culture professional, as a product development person, doesn't matter what you're doing. If you know who your friends are, it's easy to come to work and do stuff for your friends. You know how to plan a party that your friends are going to love. You know how to put together a marketing message that your friends are going to think is fantastic. You know how to build a brand that your friends are just going to be super loyal to because they're your friends. So that's what this is all about. It's all about data and stats and analysis, and all comes from like deep, hardcore research and a whole lot of work to get us to this point. But now we're at a point where we can turn all these functions for established businesses, for entrepreneurs, for startups. Just think about what your life would be like if you knew how to answer every question that comes along because you know who your friends are. It makes it really, really simple.
And I think one thing that's really important to note here is you said in the beginning of our conversation that when you do things by demographics, you're only getting about a 10% hit rate. In other words, within any group, there's only about 10% are going to actually agree on a core set.
Yeah.
The number is much higher when you're going into these archetypes.
Oh, yeah.
I think the agreement on the core values is something like about 80%, 82%. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, so it can go as high as 89% so far in the profiling we've done, where if people of a similar set of values are put together instead of people of a similar age are put together, you get about a 10% similarity on all things
Mhm.
around the age-based cohort. The values-based cohort, you get as much as an 89% similarity. So you put that into some more understandable ways of thinking about it. If you're going to spend a buck talking to a group of people or doing something for a group of people, it's like you get a 10-cent return on investment if you use demographics. You can get as much as an 89-cent return on investment if you're using values as a way to spend that buck. So it really just comes down to which buck do you want to spend? Do you want to spend the 10-cent dollar or the 89-cent dollar? And even if our stats and data are half wrong, and it's only a 46-cent dollar, it's still way better than the 10-cent dollar. And even if we're three-quarters wrong and it's only a, what would that be, 23-cent dollar instead of a 10-cent, it's still twice as good as using demographics. So what do you got to lose here? And by the way, it's not that, it's only plus or minus 3.5% wrong with a 95% level of confidence. So it's nowhere near 75% wrong. So it varies from group to group. It's not always going to be 89%, but it's always going to be way better than using demographics. Let's take it back to what we were just talking about a moment ago. Here, you got a room full of people who are all baby boomers and they earn $250,000 a year and they're all married. And they have a white collar job and a college education. And you got to figure out how to do some stuff for them. You got to track them, get them to buy something, whatever. What are you going to do? You're just going to be like, let's see, white collar guys with a decent sports. They're probably all like sports. That's what you're going to do. Now take that same that same number of people, and they're in another room across the hall, and they're all your friends. You know exactly. You know them all really well. You know what makes them tick, and you can look at that group and go, I know what's going to get these folks to do what I want them to do because I know who they are. They're my buddies. Way simpler than just making stuff up based on what you think you know about a demographic group of people.
So much of the digital advertising space today is organized around bidding against demographics. So as a practical business owner, marketer, entrepreneur, and you're trying to reach these archetypes using traditional digital marketing metrics, I wouldn't say that today there's a natural way to do that where you can bid against the loyalists, right? That's just not how the advertising platforms are set up. So in a practical way, let's say we all determined we were going after the loyalists as one of our key archetypes. In a practical sense, how would a business leader or
Right.
business owner go about doing that?
Let's go back to the reading glasses. You still got to put a demographic fence around a group of people and say, I'm going to sell my $2,000 platinum reading glasses to people who are a certain income. They're, let's say, I'm going to actually hold, nobody can tell because this is an audio podcast, but I'm wearing a pair of glasses. They're really, really wide. So they're definitely for guys. And they're not, I wish they were platinum, but let's pretend they are. So we got platinum reading glasses for guys. So they're going to have a certain age, they're male, and they're going to have a certain income. So you still use that information to go buy your media and choose your channels and decide where you're going to, you got it, because it's still very largely, as you said, things are being sold to us based on demographics so far. Give me a few more years. We'll see if we can't change all that. But now you know what to say to those people on those channels because they're your buddies. You know what those folks who are of that age and of that income and are going to be listening in those channels. You know how to frame up your message instead of sitting back and using guesswork and wishful thinking around demographic stereotypes. You can go that extra layer and say, here's what's going to get them to yes, which is what we're all really trying to do.
And the last question I have before we wrap up is anybody who's worked for any large company knows that the leaders of those companies and the product owners tend to want to go after everybody. They still think
Yeah,
that if we laid out these 15 archetypes, they would say let's go after all 15. And of
yeah,
course, that defeats the purpose of having archetypes.
yeah.
So when you're advising clients that look, this is the way we can break up the world, but we actually have to focus on a couple if we're going to be effective here. What are some practical ways that business leaders and owners uh, or even marketers who are trying to have this conversation with their business leaders to actually focus in on who your true core target is?
Well, I mean, there's three ways to figure out the values of your target audience. The first one is you can hire my company, and yep, blatant plug. Uh, and it's we're not the most expensive kid on the block, but it's not for somebody who's like trying to start a company out of the garage at a ping pong table with two buddies and a can of cold water. It's not gonna work for you. Uh, but it's certainly the most accurate. And for the bosses out there, it gives you that statistical accuracy that allows you to make risky decisions and do something different than your competitors are going to do because you know that it's going to work. You know what's making people tick. They're your friends. Second way is you can spend $16 and get $14, whatever it is. I've lost track these days for my book called The Death of Demographics. Use that quiz, points you towards one of those archetypes, and then you can go to your boss and say, or if you are the boss, and say, okay, we've narrowed it down. Our entire target audience fits into this, primarily fits into this archetype. It's not as accurate as a custom study, but you know what? I like to say you're at least playing the value graphic piano. You're on the right instrument. You're not using that broken demographic cello over in the corner there with no strings and a broken foot. You're at least thinking the right thoughts. And then the third way is absolutely free. You don't got to do anything except ask these three questions. We call this the three telltale questions. And these are questions that we've tested in multiple places around the world and multiple kinds of people. And if you ask them often enough, this is a longer term play. This isn't going to happen right away. You got to ask these questions long term to lots and lots of people, and you got to find a way to collect all their responses and then start looking at it and going, I'm seeing some themes emerge here in the answers. And those themes will be values bubbling up to the surface. So the first question, why do you go to work every day? People will tell you it's for their family, it's for because it's their creative outlet, it's because they're loyal to their bosses. They're going to have all kinds of different reasons. And they'll have all their kinds of different ways of saying it. But your job is to write them all down and then stand back and go, oh, I see some patterns in the noise here. And that's the values for this group of people, my customers. Second question, you just won the lottery. And so why would you give away half of your winnings? And this one you got to probe a little deeper because people will tell you what they want to give it to. Oh, humanitarian, this or that, or is it? No, no. Why? Why would you give away half of your lottery winnings? Same thing. Listen for the patterns in the noise. That's the values bubbling to the surface. And the third one, which is also a great thing you can do with your friends next time you're out sitting around having dinner or having a few drinks, you learn a lot about your friends if you ask this question. You get to say some stuff. You get to write a letter to yourself from 10 years ago. And what would you say and why those things? And again, you have to probe because there's always a smartass in the room who's going to say, buy Google stock, or like, okay, got it. Yeah, got it. All right, cool. Got you. Okay, ha ha ha, you're hilarious. Now, why? Why would you do that? And what else would you say? Is that really all you'd say? What else would you say? And why those things? So you see the pattern here. It's the why, right? Why do you go to work? Why would you give away half your lottery winnings? Why would you say that stuff to yourself? You get this rare opportunity to talk to yourself in the past. It's Simon Sinek's why. So you can get down to those whys, and now we've got data to back it up. Now you're at this magic place where the drivers behind why people do these important things in their life is the raw material you get to work with and go, if that's how people are making decisions about the important stuff, then we can use that to get them to make the decisions we want them to make about buying our thing or subscribing to our whatever. So the boss question is a hard one. We keep running into folks who are more senior in organizations who I call the customer whisperers, because they want to run off gut. You know, I know our customers. I've been the executive vice president of marketing for 20 years. I know everything. I need some kind of database. What's going on? Is they're a little afraid that maybe their gut around their customers is not up to snuff compared to actual hardcore data about what's making people do things. There's there's no way to win the argument with those guys. But there's a whole lot of people out there who are realizing the limitations of these old-fashioned ways of thinking about people. Listen, we live in a time where we've reinvented everything from pizza delivery to car ownership to space travel, and we've yet to rethink the way we think about each other. This fundamental core piece of the whole business world is identifying and understanding each other. And we're still using the same tools we've been using for thousands and thousands of years. I think it's time for a little disruption, a little bit of a new way of approaching things, because people today are different than they used to be. And it's all based on what's important in their life. And that's how they're deciding to live. So we got to get a handle on that if we're going to be successful.
If folks would like to get in touch with you and perhaps engage your company, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, we'll have to give you all these links and stuff because it's a lot, but there's two websites to go to. The Value Graphics Research Company website is at valuegraphics.com. So if you're interested in you don't even have to be interested in hiring us. Just go and there's some stuff you can sign up for. It's some free downloads. We're always throwing out new things that we learn on the blog. So that's a fun one to do. And I do a lot of speaking and a lot of, leading large groups through research that we do for those engagements. So whenever I speak, we do a study on whoever my audience wants to understand. That's what my speech is about. I get up and go, here's what you need to know about people who buy pet food or whoever it is I'm talking to. And so that website is davidallisoninc.com. And then, of course, social media. I live on LinkedIn primarily. I'm certainly not shy. So if you just Google my name, I'll pop up, or Google my name. Put my name in LinkedIn and I'll pop up. And you know what? Google too. If you just put my name in there, I'll pop up because, we're not shy.
And the book is The Death of Demographics, Value Graphic Marketing for a Values-Driven World. The author is David Allison, who spent his time today with us, speaking with our audience about all the topics. And we just scratched the surface. I encourage all of my listeners, get the book. You need to spend some quality time with it, as I have over the last couple of weeks. And will be many, many more things that come out of that and many more questions. So, David, if folks do read your book and they have any specific follow-ups or questions for you, is LinkedIn as good a
Yeah.
spot as any to
Yeah.
send
Yeah.
some questions?
Yeah. Come say hi on LinkedIn. Let's be buddies. And I'm happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
Fantastic. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me over.
I hope you found that interview as insightful and as eye-opening as I did. I have been involved in communications, marketing, market research for many, many years. And I have certainly been schooled in the demographic arena and been brought up in that space. But I do think that David's contributions are vital to how we actually help group people together. And I thought it was very important, if you go back and listen to that interview again, to think about the magnitude, the order of magnitude difference it makes. That if you put people into demographic groups and try to target them with marketing or even political messaging just based on a factor like age or like gender or geographic location, and that exclusively in the absence of understanding the values, that you only get about 10% agreement within that group on any one buying decision or even worldview. But that when you break it down by one of the 56 values that David breaks down in his book, you get an almost 80 to 85% match among people's worldviews when you look at it through the eyes of their values. Um, the difference between 10% and 80 to 85% is about as big of a difference as there can be in any sort of statistical analysis. So I think it's a very important contribution. I hope you will go back and listen to this interview again. There was a lot that we covered. There was a lot of nuance in there, and David made a lot of very important points that even I feel like I need to go back a couple times and listen to more carefully. And I strongly encourage you to pick up his book, The Death of Demographics. We'll have a link to it in the description to this program. It'll certainly be available on my website, brianjmatos.com. We'll promote it on our social media channels as well, which I'll give you in a moment. And of course, Amazon, has the book widely available, very easy to have it brought directly to your home. You're searching for The Death of Demographics by David Allison. And again, we thank David for his time. We will have links to all of his websites on the description for this program, and again on my website, brianjmatos.com. Speaking of which, let me give you the information for how to reach out to me in case you don't already have it. If you have any comments, questions, follow-ups from this interview, I'd love to hear from you via email. You can reach me at info at brianjmatos.com. You can find me on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, at Brian J. Matos. You can follow my Facebook fan page, the Brian J. Matos Podcast, or just find me on Facebook, Brian.Matos. I'm also available on Instagram at Brian J. Matos, and we post clips of this and all of our shows on our YouTube channel at Brian J. Matos Podcast, or just search for Brian J. Matos on YouTube and you will find our clips. I find that to be a great way to share this show for the first time with folks who might not be familiar with the program and aren't sure if they want to commit a full hour or half hour to a show. Send them one of our 5 to 10 minute clips, give them a sense of what we talk about here, and give them a preview of this show. And I'm convinced that the vast majority of folks, once they get a little snippet of the show, they will want to learn more about our fascinating guests and the topics that we cover here. Quick preview of what's coming up on the program. The theme of demographics is going to continue, but I think it was very timely that we had David on this week because in the coming weeks, we're going to talk about different elements of demographics that David pointed out are still relevant, and age being one of them. So, coming up on the program, Nick Palmarini is going to be joining us from the UK. Nick is the head of the National Innovation Center on Aging in the UK, and I think that will be a fascinating conversation around age, the specific element of demographics, and really it's about as we get older and what traits are important for us as a society to keep in mind as people age and to understand how we avoid stereotypes, particularly negative stereotypes, in a world where that is all too common, but also how we think about longevity and quality of life and how we make the world more accessible to people who may start to develop some challenges of movement or other challenges later in life, but still have so much to give to the world. And there are so many different ways to look at this topic, but I think his is a fascinating view, and I really look forward to that. One element of that we're going to talk about in particular is the area of loneliness and how that affects physical and cognitive diseases in those who are in the aging communities. So, a lot of fascinating topics to cover on that uh, topic. And then Tina Woods will be joining us to talk about another element of aging, sticking on the longevity theme, sticking with the demographic theme. Tina is she's really on a mission. She's a mission-driven social entrepreneur, and the founder and CEO of Collider Health, who works with private and public and third-party organizations in the United Kingdom on the topic of aging, particularly healthy aging, and all that we have to think about in regards to that. So we have two really fascinating and interesting guests coming up. Look, this is an aging country. The Western Hemisphere in general is aging. And believe it or not, the world as a whole, if you exclude just a few key pockets of it, is getting older faster than it was before. So it's going to be an important topic these next 2 weeks. And I think and I hope that the discussion that we had today with David on values sets up those conversations on the areas of demographics like age that still have salience and still have relevance. But perhaps by having the conversation in the context of both age and values, we can get into a more deeper appreciation of our elders and their place in our society and what we all have to do to make sure that we can live the healthiest, longest lives possible. So, great topics coming up on the program in this month. We look forward to having you back in the weeks to come. Please share this program with your friends and family. Post about us on your social media channels, and let's make sure that everybody gets to enjoy these great interviews that we're doing by sharing them with the widest network of curious minds that we possibly can. Thank you all for listening again. Look forward to speaking on the next episode. And as always, I remind you to stay curious.